everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Should we move down?
I'm Elizabeth Dorr. I'm the Associate Director of Source, so you probably got the email from me yesterday. Food is coming. It should have been here a little while ago, but they're running behind. It will come, so just hope when it does come and after it's set up, just ask you not to all like run towards the back for it. So, but you know, we have enough food for everybody, so. So yeah, it might just be kind of something you have to take on the way out or at the very end, or you know, you can get up, feel free to get up and get some while you're there. And we'll make sure to save some for you guys too. So,
Thank you.
So we are recording this, thus all of the microphones, and then there's a camera as well back there so that others who are not here can actually watch this as well. So first, before we get started, I wanted to ask you, how many of you actually viewed the online module that we sent out? We've got a proud bunch up here. Okay, so we have a handful. Have any of you viewed it just partially? Got, you know, at least? Okay, great. So, well, I'll give you just a bit of an overview, but honestly, this conversation is going to really mirror the conversation that, or the discussion points that came up in the online module. It's gonna, you know, it might be a little bit of a repeat, but it's more of a dialogue this time than, you know, just a video that's beaming out to you. So the online module project, the Source online module project began, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago even. And because there's this desire to have something online that Source produced to prepare students, faculty, and staff at Hopkins to work with the Baltimore community. And so we have a series of 3 modules, as you probably saw if you clicked on the link that I sent you. And the first one is the history between Hopkins and Baltimore. And this is actually, that's going to be the focus of this. And then the other 2 are focused on both competencies and also principles of partnership. And so I just see a few people actually in the room who helped participate in the module, both in the creation of it and creation of all of them, and the creation and contributed content as well. So I'm going to point out Mindy and Stephen and Cherie. Sorry, I have to point you out right as you come in. And anybody else who's also contributed to the module, and all of the great work, because it's been a long time coming, and it's been, the history module in particular was the longest, because it is, you know, there are so many things to bring up, and there are so many discussions that it opens up. But what it really, you know, what we felt was important was having, and Rebecca too, I didn't see you come in. Rebecca is actually, can you raise your hand? Rebecca and her team at Newlands actually did all of the recording for it, and so what really emerged, instead of just, you know, having it be, this is the history, we told it through voices of folks who are part of that history and part of Baltimore, and you know, we have 3 of those voices here today, and we also have Stephen and Graham here who were participating in the module and integral in making it possible. And one thing to note about the module as well, especially since we require a lot of the courses that we work with to present or to have the module, have their students take the module, and it opens up a lot of questions. So it's not, you know, it's not tight and neat. We don't have, you know, all of the answers laid out in the module. It's really meant as a starting point to a discussion, and so we hope to continue that here. Am I missing anything, Mindy? Graham? So what I am actually going to do, I'm not going to talk anymore, but I'm going to turn it over to the panel. The online module, yeah. About how they can generate it. Okay. Bishop certificate. I was like, so when you take the module, and some of you will be required to do this for classes, especially if, you know, Mindy's teaching it, or if we have some of our service learning faculty fellows teaching them. They will generate a certificate of completion, which Bishop Miles has done and completed the module successfully. There will be a series of questions at the very end of it that will, I think it's, if you get 80% correct, you'll have the certificate generated. It's just a PDF. So if you aren't taking it for a class and you just want to show us your certificate, feel free to send it to Source. Say, "Yay, I did it!" So and we're also, I should note that we are also creating. Yeah, come on up. We are also creating a facilitator's manual so that, this is something that we hope will continue to evolve and really be the beginning of these discussions. So, so now I'm going to turn it over to panelists. So for those of you who've actually, who saw the module, you'll recognize these faces. And you'll, so you guys are famous in the Baltimore community. So what I'm actually going to have you all do is introduce yourselves. I'm going to start with Graham here to kind of turn it over to our moderator, Graham, who also is kind of our narrator of sorts of the module.
Hi, I'm Graham Mooney. I'm a faculty member in the Institute of the History of Medicine, which is a department of the school, which is part of the Department of the History of Medicine in the School of Medicine. I also have a joint appointment over here, and I teach classes on the history of public health, one of which is an online class, which if you're FPH students, you can take next third term. And I also teach a history of public health in Baltimore class, which is actually running now, and some of the students in the class are here, so hopefully they'll be able to contribute to the discussion about the history of Baltimore. And I was just really delighted to be part of this project because I think it's really important for you guys to understand something about the history of the way in which Hopkins has operated in this local community and how it's important for you to grasp that history as you actually work in the community. So I've not met all these panel members. A lot of them have sat in my office to record some of the module, but it's great to be part of this panel.
Would you like for me
Go
to
ahead.
start?
Yeah.
So I'm Janice Bowie. I'm a little out of breath because I ran up from what I call the low rent district, which is Hampton House. And I apologize for being late. I'm getting married on Sunday. Today is my last working day, and people have been stopping by, and and I just was totally distracted. So when Mindy called me, I'm like, oh my God! So I apologize for that, but I think I have a good reason, at least a good excuse. So as I said, I'm Janice Bowie. I am an associate professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society. And I have been living here in Baltimore since 1991, when I came here as a doctoral student and then had no intentions of staying. And the next thing I know, I joined the faculty, and this is home. And I teach two courses, one which will be next term, which is Introduction to Community-Based Participatory Research. And then in the fourth term, I also teach a course on implementation and sustainability of community-based health programs. Both of those courses should tell you a little bit about me, which is that most of my work focus on research in conjunction with community partners. And I also have a particular interest in the connection between spirituality and health as well. And in terms of content area, I tend to focus not exclusively, but predominantly in cancer control.
Okay, I'm Tracy, and I work here at Hopkins. I am a community engagement coordinator, and what I do in that position is to work with community groups around environmental health issues, and I also work with the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center and helping kind of shape and work with their outreach group and getting information back to the community, because that's what we hear a lot. We have a lot of information here at Hopkins, and it stays right here, and no one gets to know what's out there and how they can benefit from knowing about that information. So that's basically what my job is to work with community groups and connecting them with either researchers or programs and information about, to help them make better decisions in improving their health outcomes.
Bishop Douglas Miles, the senior pastor of Cornelia Baptist Church. I'm the founding pastor. The church was established in 1992 when I returned to Baltimore after a 4-year hiatus in midlife crisis in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm a Hopkins alumnus, having graduated in the class of 1970. Lifetime, other than those 4 years, resident of Baltimore. Went to school here in East Baltimore, Dunbar High School. 46 years in ministry, former co-chair of Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development Build. a member of the board of the Maryland Citizens Health Initiative, twice president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, and co-founder of the Baltimore Interfaith Coalition.
Thank you. Well, what we're going to do today is just have an open discussion about the history of Hopkins and its relationship to Baltimore. I've got a bunch of questions I want to get through, and we'll come to some of them, if not all of them. If there's anything that you guys want to ask as it comes up, please do stop us, raise your hand, because we want this to be a conversation and you to find out as much about Baltimore as you can. There's a roving microphone, so make sure you wait for the microphone before you do ask a question, and it'll be brought to you. One of the things I did want to start off with was, you've had an introduction to the panel, and one of the great things about the module, I think, is the way it interweaves personal histories and personal stories and personal experiences with the wider history. So I wanted to get our panel just to say a little bit more about their life and experiences in Baltimore itself. And one of the things that I've experienced, I've lived in Baltimore for 10 years, and I've lived on the west side of the city for 9 of those. And it's very interesting when I meet students and other faculty and other residents of the city. The first thing they ask you is, what do you do? And say, I'm an assistant professor at Hopkins. And so you see this sort of stereotype migrating towards the front of their head about a white middle-class professor. And they'd say, where do you live? And I say, on the west side. And sometimes you mean Ellicott City? No, I don't mean Ellicott City. I mean the west side of the city, just a few blocks west of the B&O Railroad Museum, the stadium. And so the eyebrow raises, as if I've grown a second head. And then I tell them that that area of the city has actually got one, and has had for quite a while, the lowest life expectancy in Baltimore. So then I grow a third head, and then I tell them that I don't own a car, and then I grow a fourth head. And so it's really interesting how place and ideas of place and the power of place within the city condition people's impressions, and also media impressions of the city as well. And I will say one thing, that when I told a chair of a department in this school all those things, he sat and looked at me for a couple of seconds. He just said, why would you want to live there? And I think that's going to be an important point about why people want to live around here, what's important to their lives around here, how Hopkins has affected it, and what we can do to help change it, because Hopkins has had a role in people's experiences. So if you could just say a bit more about your life and how the personal experiences have fitted into your work, that would be great.
So since I went first last, I think I should let
let's go
Bishop
up and
Miles
down.
go,
Go ahead.
and then we'll work our way this way.
Well, as I said, I'm basically a lifetime resident of Baltimore. I'm one of the few Baltimoreans who has roots on both the east and west side of town. Having gone to school on both the east and west Baltimore, I went to Booker T. Washington, then junior high school, because it was the only African-American middle school or junior high school that had an accelerated program when I came out of elementary school. And went to Dunbar High School here on the east side, and for my senior high experience. Graduated from Dunbar in the class of '66 and was literally strong-armed by my counselors and principals to enroll at Hopkins, because Hopkins was seeking Negro students then to become a part of the Hopkins community. In talking about Baltimore, I think you have to look at this city as a southern town that thinks it's a northern city. And all of the negatives, if I can speak in that way, of southern life is a part of the Baltimore experience. I've found it to be a city where every major decision is driven by race. It's very parochial, but at the same time very relational. You scratch 2 relationships in with anybody and you're touching somebody that you know. Until very recently, there was a friendly competition between East and West Baltimore in terms of the African American community. Those from the east side were the old town African American community, and those African Americans on the west side were those who had migrated up from the south. Very neighborhood driven until about 20 years ago, where really the collapse of neighborhoods happened. And even though the city still lists 86 distinct neighborhoods, that's more myth than reality. Because the city, one, is so predominantly African American now, that there are very few really mixed communities, and where there is a white population, it tends to be isolated. What else do I need to say? That enough? That's all?
Well, I'm actually glad to be on this panel because I'm learning a lot from both of the panelists. I was born and raised in East Baltimore all my life, and East Baltimore was home. It's hard when I talk to students who come to Baltimore, it's hard for them to believe that we actually lived in neighborhoods where we didn't lock our doors at night. It was very friendly. We took care of each other. And that's what I grew up with. And the school experience was different. In elementary school, I was very fortunate to be in elementary school, Benjamin Banneker School, which was on Greenmount and Federal Street. And I didn't realize how fortunate I was to be there until I got older, because most of our teachers, they were African American teachers because they couldn't work in teaching in other schools. And so we were privileged to have them because they were determined that we were going to be smart. And if we weren't smart, boy, we got it. They were just like on us. So you didn't really appreciate that until later. And actually, our elementary school still has reunions. We have elementary school reunions that have been going on now for 20 years. And I find it and some of the teachers are still alive. Some of my teachers are still alive, and they come to the reunion. And I'm glad to participate in that because like I said, I didn't realize how privileged I was to be in that elementary school. And then when I went to junior high school, that's when my challenges started. Middle, high school, and senior high school. The teachers, some of them act like they just hated us because we were black. And that was like a really strange feeling, but we had to be stronger, and I think it made us stronger because we knew we had to rise above this. And we talked earlier, the bishop and I talked earlier about, we got real skills when we were in school. And when we graduated, I graduated from high school in 1966 as well. And I was ready to go to work. I worked for department heads, and I worked for department heads all my work life. And I think it was because of that
That grounding.
Grounding, yeah, that I received. And East Baltimore is, it's very precious to me, and I get very upset when I go into communities have been so disinvested, because that is not what I grew up seeing. And it's so, it's so pointed that these communities were left that way for other purposes. And it's a really, I'm starting to get emotional about this. But it was like we should have never let our communities go to waste the way they did. But, and I was part of, the relocation north of Hopkins. And, it was hard for me to understand how can you have people who live in a neighborhood for 20 and some of them 70 years and be told you have to move whether you like it or not, because there's a thing called eminent domain, and because it was something that was going to benefit the larger community. And we kept thinking, well, the larger community, so we're supposed to just uproot ourselves and be disconnected for people we don't even know, people that have never had any investment in these communities. So it was kind of a rough deal for us to realize that, we had paid for our homes, we had renovated them, and now we have to be uprooted, but we still, no matter what happens, we still love East Baltimore. And I think that's why it was easy for me to move in my position as a community engagement coordinator, because I love my people that I work with. And I was a Girl Scout leader for 28 years, and a lot of the girls lived in the surrounding projects on Caroline Street. So, and they hadn't experienced a lot of things that were out for the kids to experience, because even in Girl Scouting, there was a lot of prejudices in Girl Scouting, you know, so it's like you're always, you know, being tougher, you know, as you go along, because you're meeting with all of these challenges. I'm gonna stop right now. Janice, you talk.
Well, I didn't grow up in Baltimore, but I grew up 3 hours south of Baltimore in Richmond, Virginia, which has the distinct notoriety as being the Confederate capital of the South, which is no feather in their cap. Needless to say, like Pat and Bishop Miles, I grew up in a time of segregation and integration. And I have come to appreciate that. I think that growing up during the time of segregation certainly taught me what were boundaries. I learned how to recognize covert and overt racism. And so there is something to be said about knowing that and being able to have that as part of your understanding when you encounter it. And then coming to Baltimore, which is, you know, below the Mason-Dixon line. It is a southern city. And having come from Richmond and come here, that transition was not a difficult one to make. What I often talk about when I encounter students and being among a minority of African American faculty here, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to say and to counter some of the stereotypes and myths that people have about our city. And I think because I grew up in Richmond, it is something that I understand. I think that as a university, we have to do more to help our students understand and appreciate the city, and that the city affords them many, many resources. Your trash gets picked up here. Police protection is provided. Lights on the streets are provided. All of these things that we just kind of come to take for granted. And I remember someone saying a few years ago that we have to think about these experiences where you are as a student, where I am as a faculty, that we are in this community. We work here, we live here, we play here. And we have to, as an institution, help students understand the important history of this city, the cultures, the many cultures that are here, and to appreciate that history, that some of the world's finest people had their beginnings here. And it's up to you to learn that and to appreciate that. And I think that we as an institution, and I appreciate SOURCE and I appreciate the development of this series, because that's what we're hoping to do. We're hoping to expand your understanding and enhance your appreciation for this city, and also to allow you to integrate it as a place where you study, where you work, where you live, and where you play. And that when we don't do that, we do you, our institution, and ourselves a disservice.
So just to, I mean, a lot of the students here, I assume, are very new to Baltimore quite recently. So maybe if you could give them some impressions about how you think the city has changed over the years, and the sort of changes you've observed, both for good and bad, because we don't want this to be just a bad thing. What sorts of things have changed, and what do you love and hate about the city? Things that drive you nuts, but things that you can't do without.
Well, the thing that, there isn't anything that I hate. that's too strong of a term for me. But one of the things I dislike traffic, but that isn't unique to Baltimore. I dislike police officers being on cell phones. I can't do a whole lot about that. And I dislike the unnecessary and the distractions that take us away from what's important. And I'll give you an example of that. We have had in the news as of late a number of instances of, where there has been maybe, at least allegedly, too much brutality and harassment by police officers, and people have been recording that. And to me, that's both unnecessary and a distraction. $11 million has gone into just Baltimore having to pay for cases where police have overexerted their power, their authority, and their boundaries. That's $11 million that could be used to send kids to school, to improve schools, it just, to me, is such a waste. And so I guess if I had to hate something, I hate that. What I appreciate the diversity. I appreciate the restaurants. I appreciate the cost of living. I think what has changed for me in the years that I have lived here is a reflection of what is changing in many cities, urban areas. The change is being driven by the same tensions and the same separation that we see on a national scale. And to be very frank, when President Obama, who I'm very happy to call my president, but I also want to sometimes say, because you became the first black president, it has made everything so difficult for so many people because of the polarization and the racism and the hatred and just the disrespect for the office, and I think of the president, and I think that seeing that on a national scale has filtered down to state and local politics, and we feel that every day, even in our city in Baltimore. So that's my response to that question. Pat, you will probably have some different perspectives.
No, I agree with you.
I knew that already.
But one thing, I guess I'm going to talk about the positive things that I've seen in East Baltimore, and I'm sure it happens in West Baltimore because I'm really based in East Baltimore. I see people like myself and the Bishop and Janice who are just regular people who see problems in their communities and take the time to say, I want to do something about this. I want to fix this. And Source, that's where Source comes into play, because they have connected with a lot of regular people who say, I have a AIDS problem in my community and I want to do something about it. So out of that concern, we have different organizations that come up, and most of them are run by one or two people who want to help fix some of these problems in our community. And thanks to the Source and the students who come out of Source to come and help those organizations, because all of them need help. And sometimes it seems like, okay, you work with these organizations and they're not responsive. And a lot of times they're not responsive because they're the one-man organization trying to do everything. So they can't just sit at a desk and have an administrative assistant to contact people or to do things or to write grants. And I see a lot in this community. Mindy, there are a lot of organizations that you work with, and I'm not sure how many, because I know when I first started working here, that was one of the things that I did. I would get in my car with another young lady, Lois Banks, and we would just snake up and down this area and locate what communities, what organizations were out there working for communities. And that's how we started building that whole bank of organizations for the SOURCE program. So I see that, and I really appreciate that. And a lot of the people, they're not getting paid. I don't know how they survive, to be honest with you, but they are so driven that they want to help fix what's so broken in our communities. And we live, and they're right next to Hopkins. And, you know, Hopkins put out this, you know, this revelation that they spend all this money in the communities. And if you go to the communities, they'll say, well, I'm not feeling that money. You know, so where's it really going? And I think that's something that really has to be addressed. You know, there's a lot of research. East Baltimore has been a research lab for so many years, and the people are getting tired of being researched. The people know what's wrong with them. They need help in fixing what's wrong. They don't need to be just part of a community advisory board and taken away from their dinner at night. You know, so it's a lot that needs to be fixed with that. If Hopkins is going to get this money, they need to start putting the community groups as a line item. Not just think that they're going to just come and help Hopkins because they're there. You know, we have to be really equitable as to how we work with the community groups and the relationship with Hopkins. And a lot of that is what I do when I work with community groups. I say, yes, I wear a Hopkins badge, but what I've come to do for you is because of my community concern about what's going on and how can we work together.
Well, some of the things that I love about this city is the redevelopment that has taken place in the Inner Harbor, both east and west, that has brought a new sense of commercial vitality to at least part of the city. I love the legacy of the Colts and what the Ravens are doing, and I love the Baltimore Orioles. Now, what I hate the fact, as I stated earlier, that every major decision in this city, not just in East Baltimore, but across the breadth of Baltimore, every major decision is driven by race, race and class, and that operates to the detriment of every community in this city. It keeps us at odds with one another rather than pulling together to achieve things that, some great things that could be achieved. One example of where we got past race was just last year when across the breadth of Baltimore we fought to get the $979 million to build new schools for Baltimore. That was a plus, and that no new school until recently had been built in Baltimore for 40 years. That was a major accomplishment, bringing the business community, faith community, activist community, and education community together to secure those funds. But again, when you look at what happens in this city, it's race that drives it. Back in 1965, when I was a junior at Dunbar High School, then Vice Principal Clarence Blount, who went on to become the majority leader in the state Senate, took me downtown to One Charles Center and upstairs to the top floor and showed me a diagram of what Baltimore would look like in the 21st century. And that has played out exactly as I saw it then. And what was being developed was a city that would still be divided by race and class, with a redeveloped inner harbor, circled by neighborhoods that at that time were looked upon that they would be middle-class neighborhoods inside the Beltway, and then lily white outside the Beltway. And that's how Baltimore has played out. Race determines the issue of police brutality. The brutality doesn't occur across the breadth of Baltimore. It occurs in the African-American community. That's where the police brutality takes place. Race determines the quality of education in this city. Back when the city was majority white, people in the county were fighting to get their children in Baltimore City schools. That's totally reversed now. That anybody who can get out of a Baltimore City school to go to a county school goes. Race has determined employment in this city, a city that went from a an economic base of heavy industry to service industry and minimum wage, low-paying, part-time, temporary jobs. Race drives that. 15 years ago, when the Build organization did a survey, we discovered that there were 2 rush hours in Baltimore. One at 8 o'clock, 7 to 9 in the morning, of white-collar workers coming downtown Baltimore, 90% of whom are white. And another rush hour between 5 and 6 of African Americans coming down to clean up downtown. So every major decision in this city is driven by race, and that galls me. I hate the fact that we have a Democratic majority in this city and in this state, and Democrats act like Republicans when it comes to African Americans. Downsizing, cutting budgets, cutting services. You would expect that as an African American out of the National Republican Party, but on the local level, Democrats act like Republicans, and that plays out negatively for all of us.
I think one of the things I'd add to that is, when we look at this historically, you mentioned, you mentioned neighbourhoods as being important. It's trite to say it, but Baltimore really is a city of neighbourhoods and different neighbourhoods, and the power that a lot of neighbourhoods have is really important. It's interesting to look over time how the politicians have actually ceded a lot of ground to neighbourhoods and neighbourhood associations, and there's a lot of, if you can leverage that power outside of the political system and within neighbourhood associations, you can actually get things to happen, and that can actually be both a good thing and a bad thing. And I think one of the things that Pat mentioned with all this multiplicity of agencies working, on one hand it's great because some things are being done. On the other hand, they're competing for a very small pot of resources, both human resources, financial resources, and so on. So a lot of what could be done gets missed because of that multiplicity. So that's something I'm trying to help my students understand in the history of Baltimore. We want to move on a bit. We've already covered some issues around Hopkins and Baltimore. We've spoken a little bit about Baltimore generally, and I want to get on to a little bit more about Hopkins and East Baltimore. But have we got any questions so far from anybody who we want to ask? Want to ask the panel? Okay, can you just wait for the microphone to make its way to you?
Hi, my name is Edwin Zhao, and I'm a Master's of Healthcare Administration student. And even before I arrived in Baltimore, I'd heard that it's a city of neighborhoods, and you started to talk a little bit about the power of neighborhood associations. How does that actually manifest itself in local politics, in city politics?
Well, see, I take issue with that. I don't think that Baltimore any longer is a city of neighborhoods. There are some distinct neighborhoods that exercise disproportionate influence, such as Fells Point, Canton, and Roland Park. But by and large, in the African American communities, neighborhoods virtually are ignored. The average neighborhood association in Baltimore is one senior male and 5 or 6 senior women sitting around complaining about the same issues every meeting, and nothing changes because the city is not organized. Where the organization has taken place, as through the organization that I'm a part of, Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development, political influence has been able to be exerted. But that only occurs as we're able to bring pressure on both the corporate community and the political establishment. They give nothing willingly. Again, in a city of this size, for the city administration not to be investing more than it is in after-school, out-of-school time programming is a sin before God. The fact that there's such limited opportunity for employment for African-American males and African-American youth, that's atrocious. So there really aren't a lot of neighborhoods that are really organized to combat the things that are tearing community life apart and families apart. That's why there's such a thriving drug industry. That's why crime is at the level that it's at. That's why police brutality takes place with the regularity that it takes place, because so many of the mediating institutions of the past have disintegrated. Neighborhood groups, political clubs, PTOs. So it's really not a city of neighborhoods any longer.
I'd like to also respond to that. And I agree with the bishop. I think there's also another part that sometimes, you know, we are less reluctant to talk about. I do think that at the level of things that may happen within a community, let's say for rodent control, you might have neighborhood groups that will meet, as the bishop said, and they will call City Hall and have that responded to. But when it takes on bigger issues, it tends to happen in the way in which he described. It comes through oftentimes faith-based leaders who also have and are able to leverage the political clout. Sometimes that it works very well, and other times it doesn't. And power is can be both good and can be bad. And I think that the downside of that, in my opinion, is that we sometimes put way too much onus on politicians and on faith-based institutions in the leadership. And it takes away from our own willingness to get involved. I think that it has tremendous benefit, particularly when it works around things like voter education and voter registration. But we also have to not only push up, but we need to also push in the other direction, to have these organizations, to have faith-based institutions and that level of leadership work with community groups to help them to be mobilized, to become more mobilized and to become more empowered, and to see that they can at least come together, even if their one group isn't enough, but there's power in those numbers. And I think that we've seen that kind of base become eroded. And that it sometimes puts us in a place where we're relying too much on others to help, you know, create opportunities for us. And I mean, it's a balance and it's a trade-off, but I do think that we have to be willing to acknowledge that.
Okay. What I'd like to add to that is what I look at and what I see a lot is the disintegration of the family support system. You know, a lot of our communities are, the people that live in the communities are so transient. They're there, you know, until, if they're renting, they're there until they get evicted, and then they move on. You know, so you have a lot of that. Because we don't have, we've lost a lot of our industry and factory work, and where people were, Sparrows Point, places like that, where people made really good money and they were homeowners. And once that population of people died, and the families that were coming up didn't have the same kind of job opportunities. So they started moving away, moving out, or if they stayed, they didn't have the income to keep their homes up the way they wanted, or the neighborhoods. And then you have people who will come into the community to live. They didn't care how they lived in that community. And when they were finished with that community, they moved on. And so you had a whole lot of that going on. You had broken families, teen pregnancy. So you had a lot of things that started to disintegrate our communities and losing the power that used to be in community organizations. It's just not there. The children, some people are afraid of their own kids because they're taking the power away from the parent to discipline their own children. You know, I know when my daughter looked at me that way, I said, okay, you want to leave here? You leave here the same way you came in here. You know, I'm not going to even have that conversation with you just because you think that you can tell me what to do because you can call 911. It's not happening. And you took that power was taken from parents in schools, and when I graduated from high school, I really wanted to be an algebra teacher. by the time I was in the 12th grade, the kids that were coming through there were big and bad and didn't respect anybody. And I was like, there's no way I'm doing this. I was like, as much as I love math, I was like, they were so out of order because you gave them too much power. Kids can't handle that kind of power. And it disrupted our families, our communities, the drugs, and in the 68 when we had the riots. It's like everything just started going upside downwards. Our communities were being burnt up by people who didn't live there. They took advantage of the situation. And so, and then there was no money put back into the community after the riots. So you had to like live with all of this brokenness, you know, and that's why I saw the disintegration, of our communities and neighborhood organizations. We didn't have the clean blocks where the Afros would do the clean block programs, and every community competed to be the best that they could. All of those things just went away. And then, when I know I lived near Greenmount and North Avenue, and I hadn't been over there in years, and I went back, and I was like, what the hell happened over here? There were so many vacant houses. There were houses that were torn down or half torn down. I was like, what happened here? And then I started really taking a good look at the city, and it was happening all over the place. And it's like, my whole thing is we have a Department of Planning. We have all of these departments in place to take care of our city. We pay taxes to make these things happen. And I'm like, what are you doing at your meetings? How are you planning? Who are you planning for? You're definitely not planning for the people that live in the city. So what is this plan all about? And we're seeing it as we go on, like the bishop said. There's a 20, 30-year plan about who's going to be in Baltimore City and who's not going to be in Baltimore City, and we're seeing it.
I think, too, that just the, fear has just taken over. We fear one another, we fear communities, and, and we just transmit that everywhere we go. I mean, there's an aura of fear all around you. We have, and one of the things I say to students is that, when you arrive and you go through orientation, they tell you, do this, do that, and I believe in all of that we all need to be safe, we all need to feel secure in our comings and our goings. That's true regardless of where we are and where we live and where we travel. But we are given this notion that when you are in East Baltimore, that you have to be extra vigilant of, what's going to happen. And then we get the email blasts of, another young African-American male has done this or done that. And I think that it gives rise to fear. We have kiosks on every corner, so that we can feel safe. We wear badges so we can get in and out of buildings and distinguish who's safe and who's not safe, allegedly. Some of us inside are unsafe, but if you know what I mean. But I think this fear has so given rise to politics, to the ways in which we interact with each other, the ways in which we operate. And again, we see it as at a national level. We're seeing it in our communities, and we're seeing it just in the way in our day-to-day lives. And I just think that we really have to push back against that as much as we can. And I certainly try to do that in the way that I behave and move around this institution every day.
This whole notion of, and I think a big part of what we're supposed to share today is how Hopkins relates and so forth. It's part of it is the negative image that's painted of Baltimore, even by the institution that's my alma mater. And I've fought against that since 1966, the isolation of Hopkins from the rest of the Baltimore community. The sense of us against them. I pastored when the church that I founded was established in the 2400 block of Greenmount Avenue. And Hopkins students in 1992 were being told, don't go below 25th Street to volunteer. You know, this whole notion of race and class, again, drives much of what Hopkins has done over the years and how it has perceived the city and helped its students perceive the city. We ran a very successful after-school program, developed a number of other initiatives in this community that others said could never be maintained. And so Hopkins has to drop this image of us against them. And that's still very pervasive, even with the whole redevelopment idea of EBDI. You know, I've lived through every configuration of Hopkins since the 1950s, from when they built the first community and walled it off so that Dunbar students had to walk around it to get to high school. Us against them. When I was at Hopkins in the 1960s, and just again, looking at this whole us against them, and the first black history teacher at Hopkins was a Southern white man, because it was assumed that because he grew up in the South, he knew Negroes. And he stood up in the middle of class one day of a movie about the African-American community, and he points to me and he says, "Is this real?" I mean, come on. And what I want you to, if you don't understand anything else, that Hopkins has helped play into this whole debacle of what's going on in Baltimore by being the 900-pound gorilla in the arena who often has spoken against the interests of the larger community of Baltimore. And that's why Hopkins is so negatively perceived, not just in East Baltimore, but across the whole African-American community. It's seen as, when you have the kind of investment that Hopkins has, the kind of research capability that Hopkins has, there is no reason why the problems that beset Baltimore are not better addressed. The African-American community in Baltimore leads in AIDS, hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, hantavirus, and a whole list of other things. If that were happening in the white community, Baltimore would be declared a disaster area. And everybody from the federal government to the state government to the city government would be rushing in to see how the city could be saved. All of this goes on, and hardly without a ripple being made even in the news. Even, you know, I challenged my institution 10 years ago, convene all of the major institutions here in Baltimore of higher learning, and bring to bear the brain power that's resident in this city to help solve the problems of the city. One black business, a city that's almost 70% black, the black business community is less than 4%. Something's wrong when you have one of the best business schools in the nation in this city that could be offering advice to black entrepreneurs as to how to start businesses and how to keep them going. So that's, you know, I think this is a wrong time for me to be in this setting because I'm angry about a whole lot of things right now. Okay.
Pat, is there anything you want to say about your experiences of Hopkins growing up, you know, before the urban development, you know, the perceptions that you and your friends and neighbours had of Hopkins?
Well, like I said, I'm kind of like the baby, and with these two people who know all baby and being part of being exposed to Hopkins issues, because like I said, I was working with teenagers who didn't have the opportunities to experience a lot of things. So most of my, what I did was working with the teenagers. It wasn't until I got older and started working here at Hopkins in the late 90s that I realized what is going on here. You know, what is all of this hate, this love-hate relationship is all about. Like I said, I was having my own issues with Girl Scouts because they were doing the same thing in our communities. They needed to raise their numbers of having African American girls in Girl Scouting. So they were like acting the same way Hopkins was. When they needed African Americans to make their numbers be better, then they focused their attention to the African American communities. When they needed African Americans to participate in research issues, they focused their attention to the African Americans, and that's where I got my my education about what was going on. And so long, like I said, for so long, I did not realize the impact when I worked in a study where housing issues. It's like I had neighbors who were being fined because their backyards were not maintained, but 5 houses next to them were houses that belonged to Hopkins, Kennedy Krieger, and other places, and nobody was taking care of those houses. But residents who were struggling with these low income jobs were kind of like being taken advantage of and made to pay these fines, but they weren't making Hopkins or Kennedy pay fines for the devastation that they were causing in our communities. And you look, and all I kept thinking, I'm like, okay, I live so close to Hopkins. This neighborhood has got to look better. But for it to look better meant that they had to move all of the African Americans out and tear it down and start over. Make the new housing so unaffordable that we could not move back. You know, that was a big problem. And then we had O'Malley was the mayor at that time, and all he was saying, well, we just need to tear it all down and start over. I'm like, give me a break. You're going to tear it down, but where are we supposed to live? You know, so that was kind of my issue with Hopkins and how they were working with the community.
So I believe we've got 5-10 minutes left. I'd like to end with with an opportunity for the students to understand how they can contribute to repairing some of the damage that's been done in terms of the relationship between Hopkins and East Baltimore. How do you see the people in this room being able to actually make a positive contribution and improve the city and the life of local residents as well?
Well, I want to first thank the students for their interest in coming here today to want to hear and to learn how to be better stewards of our community. And I think that we have to find a way forward. I think that there is a lot of negative history. We need to be aware of that history, but we need to take that history and use it as instruction and insight and wisdom and guidance for how we need to go forward. I think the time is we're well overdue for how we need to be good collaborators and good neighbors in this city. And I hope that the students here will take advantage of every opportunity there is to learn about the city, to be engaged in activities within the city, to find opportunities to volunteer and to give back. I really believe that we cannot afford to just take up space here at Hopkins, get our degrees and move on. One of the things that Pat said is that, that Hopkins is a Research One institution. It's very proud of that tradition and that place in the world. And it has its benefits for being able to do what we do here. But we cannot afford to do that at the exclusion of the problems that, as Bishop Miles said, beset our communities. We have to not be premier in the world. We have to be premier to our neighbors in Baltimore. And every opportunity that you have to do that while you're here, and even when you leave here, you are the ambassadors of this institution. You can either talk negatively about it, you can defend it, or you can try and erase whatever memory you have of this city. But I think you have an opportunity to do everything you can in your power and in your profession going forward as a public health graduate of this school, to be spokesman for this city, and while you're here, to do everything that you can to be a part of this city. That's who you are while you're here, and for however long you're here.
And just thinking of you guys being ambassadors, one of the main things that I would like to leave with you is that when you interact with community groups and community programs, listen first to what they have to say. Don't come in ready to fix something that may not even be the problem that needs fixing. So that I like to leave that with you, is to be very open-minded and listen before you just, okay, here's the plan, before you know that's the plan that's needed.
In her last days of life, I went to visit my aunt in a nursing home, and she was in the final throes of cancer. And when I walked into the room, I was also her pastor. And she said, Douglas, you see that mess that I made? And I'm looking around and I'm saying, my aunt is delirious from the medication that she's receiving. Because she kept, you see that mess that I made? And I'm looking for the mess. And she said, see, right there on the wall. And she was pointing at a picture of her children. You see the mess that I've made. You see the mess that this generation has made. Mm-hmm. I challenge you to use your opportunity here at Hopkins, and when you leave Hopkins, to try to clean up the mess. Get involved here as a student in the life of this city beyond the university. Mm-hmm. Challenge this university to rise up to be the best that it can. Just a few years ago, I almost went to jail with some Hopkins students who were challenging the university over its wages that it was paying its lowest paid employees. They made a difference. They started cleaning up the mess. And when you leave here, no matter where you go, take the skills that you've learned here to make wherever you land a better place.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel for a fabulous discussion. Bishop Miles, Pat Tracy, and Janice Bowie.
Thank
you all so much. It's great to see the discussion happening live and not just right in front of you on the screen. But for those of you who haven't